oracle come around in ancient Roman times simply as a myth? Or was there some stunning psychic accuracy that led to the endearing story of these amazing women? Was there one oracle who was clearly more powerful than the rest? And did her prophecies ultimately become of such great value that it created the equivalent of Area 51 in ancient Roman times to guard these secrets that she produced? And were those secrets secretly encoded into the Great Seal of the United States on the back of the dollar bill? These are the questions we're about to answer in this episode. Oracles were the wise women of ancient Roman times. The term oracle means prophetess. And remember that we are dealing with a different type of society. It was very common, for example, for ordinary people to try to practice psychic abilities and to see if they could get results. One of the classic strategies that was used during Roman times was for people to go to a certain spiritual icon or religious statue in the center of town. It could be an omphalos stone. We'll get into what that is in a minute. They would go there, they would ask the question of what they wanted to know the answer to, and then they would cover their ears, and they would walk to the outskirts of town while in a deep meditative, prayerful state of consciousness. And then when they felt right, when they were away from most of the crowds, but there were still some people around, they would take their hands off of their ears. And the story goes that the first fragment of speech that you hear, the first coherent sentence that anybody says, is the answer to the question. And it, of course, worked very, very well. People would get results this way. And honestly, I do believe, with all the aspects of the science of consciousness that have now been explored by modern scientists, that we are living in a universe where divination can be done. People would use things like reading tea leaves, or using tarot cards or runes in order to gain information. And this was commonplace. But there were certain people whose abilities were so much greater than everyone else that they became renowned for their accuracy and the power of the information that they conveyed. Typically, you've heard the term oracle, but what you may not have heard is that they were also called sibyls. For some interesting reason, it was usually women who were the oracles. There were no male oracles, as far as I know. If you did find any evidence that there were, please let us know in the comment section, because I'm not aware of it. It seems that this was a female-based phenomenon. There was something about women and the position that they would hold that allowed them, in certain cases, to be able to make direct conscious access to some greater source of living information. And that information may very well be extraterrestrial beings. There is abundant evidence during this time in Roman history that we were seeing extraterrestrial beings encountering humanity. Remember, by the time we get to the New Testament and the arrival of Jesus, Jesus arrived into the Roman Empire. And the angels that are referred to in the Bible were also occurring during this same time frame and were occurring in this same area. So we that are referred to in the Bible were also occurring during this same time frame and were occurring in this same area. So we have to rethink a lot of things and look at the possibility that we were in a society in which, at certain times, exceptional humans who may have looked like us but were not like us in many other ways were walking among us. Some of these oracles may have actually experienced in-person contacts with extraterrestrial beings that then led to a telepathic rapprochement in the aftermath, where they can now speak into the woman's mind, and if she is in a nice state of meditation, she can gain receptivity and be able to channel in these messages much more clearly than would normally be possible. So it is a known and accepted fact that in ancient Roman times, there were 12 sibyls, 12 wise women who each had her own area. So depending on the region you were in, there was one sibyl, there was one oracle that was renowned to be the best. And they apparently did well. They did live in a very ascetic lifestyle. They typically were isolated. They were not necessarily celebrities per se. They didn't want the attention. They would stay on the outskirts, but they probably were making decent money because people would make offerings. And of course, the more successful the prophecies are, the more successful the results are, the more people are going to be generous. So this was potentially a fairly lucrative business. But of course, it's a very fine line when you do prophecy in terms of, can you stay in alignment? Are you going to let your ego take over, or are you going to stay accurate? So amongst all of these sibyls, they all used something called an omphalos stone. Now this is pretty strange. This is something a lot of people are not aware of. The omphalos stone is a peculiar looking object. It's actually an oval type of shape, and it was fairly large. And it was believed that this stone served almost like a two-way telepathic radio to extraterrestrial intelligence. So when you look at the omphalos stone, when you see various depictions of it, you see what looks like a cross-hatched pattern over the surface of this egg-shaped object. Now, I have long speculated that the omphalos stone may in fact be a carved relic of something that originally was a technology. So when I look at that omphalos stone, I like to envision that the original ones were extraterrestrial technology, that there may have been some kind of glass below the cross-hatching, and that there was a luminous source inside, which would mean this would be a very visually compelling thing to look at. Even if all you had to do is just put a candle inside the glass, it would still have this spooky appearance. The cross-hatching would throw shadows onto the wall. But I do think there may also have been actual technology that extraterrestrials left behind, and that the stones that we now see might just be an honorable depiction of what they originally had. These stones may also have actually been working portal devices. And what I mean is that they might actually have been machines that created a Stargate that allowed these extraterrestrials to physically enter the room with those women and give them messages. It's also possible that the object was able to get them to telepathically come into the room if they didn't want to make a full materialization. So this is a technological question that has never really been answered, and my guess is that the answer is probably down there in the Vatican Library, as with so many other things from the ancient times. This could very well be a real technology, but amongst all the people who had these abilities, there was one oracle, there was one wise woman, there was one sibyl who clearly rose above the rest, and that was the Sibyl of Cumae. Now, the Sibyl of Cumae was a woman who lived in the westernmost territory of Rome. She lived in an area that was known for there being volcanic activity. Mount Vesuvius was right in this area. And what will happen when you have volcanic activity is that you get lava tubes. You'll get these tubes that are hollowed out, that are big enough for someone to walk through. And in certain cases, those tubes were then literally built out, and you have people able to create brick walls and kind of finish off whatever nature had started. So remember now that when you're in a volcanic area, you could have a whole intersecting series of these tubes that are all crisscrossing through one another, creating basically the equivalent of a labyrinth inside. Another interesting thing that most people are not aware of in our modern times is that the actual volcanic gases themselves, specifically a gas known as ethylene, is psychoactive and will create effects similar to LSD psilocybin magic musca. Ethylene gas is very dangerous, and I absolutely am not recommending anybody to try to inhale this gas. It is potentially lethal. There's a lot of carbon monoxide in volcanic gas, and so please don't try this at home. But it is a fact that if you are exposed to ethylene without carbon monoxide, that you will get these alternate states of consciousness. So the Sibyl of Cumae is a very interesting story because this is a woman who actually lived inside this volcanic cave complex. That's where she spent all of her time. She wasn't just walking around out in the open. She was inside these dank, dark caves. And inside these caves, they have this ethylene gas that would burble up through these grottos. And you have a grotto, meaning an area that's kind of like a big opening where you might have water down at the bottom. And similar to the concept of volcanic hot springs. If you've ever been to a hot springs, then you know that sometimes that water has a lot of sulfur in it and it smells like rotten eggs. And it's also a whitish color if you get really, really sulfurous water. There can be ethylene in that too, and so that's part of why people get this big high when they go into a hot springs. But of course, if you're inside the volcanic caves themselves, you could be breathing a lot more of this gas. So a grotto would be an area where you have hot water, volcanically heated water, that is rising up from the ground, and it's there bubbling perhaps with gases coming up. And so if you were to actually go over those gases, you're going to experience a much higher concentration of ethylene. Now there was one other component to this formula, and that was the use of bay laurel leaf extract. If you're like me and you've had some homemade soup and your mother has a bunch of spices on a spice rack, one of the spices that she may have in the little jars is bay leaf. That's the leaf of the laurel plant, specifically the bay laurel plant. And apparently, if you were to take those fresh laurel leaves and concentrate them down into an extract, and you ingest that extract while then breathing ethylene gas, there's some sort of synergy between the two that makes the effect a lot stronger. So this could be a Roman equivalent of what we also see in Egypt with the blue lotus extract, where once again you're getting a psychedelic effect. And of course, we're usually more familiar with the ones that come out of Africa, which would be like iboga or ibogaine, or the stuff that we have always heard about in South America, such as bufotenine from toad skin, or DMT, which could come from mushrooms or could come from the synergy of two different vines with ayahuasca. Either way, the point is, the bay laurel extract with the ethylene gas apparently created this powerful effect, and the Sibyl of Cumae would climb up onto a metallic tripod, 3 legs of metal that had little ladders on them, and there was a chair in the middle. And apparently she was able to have this built to maximize her effects. Eyewitnesses reported seeing her take the extract and then climb up this large metal tripod over the volcanic grotto and start taking some deep breaths. And she wouldn't stay on the chair. The chair is only there for her to breathe enough ethylene that she would get a psychedelic effect. And then she would climb off of the chair, and the eyewitness reports were actually pretty scary. And this is one of the kind of strange and disturbing things about this. She acted very crazy, that her hair would be all crazy. She'd be going around babbling and saying funny things and acting in a very unusual way. Lots of, tremor type of behavior, acting really bizarre. And then in that consciousness, she would either speak prophecies or in some cases write them down. So actually, before we get into any more of these prophecies, I want to show you now where she was, because this has become an Italian pilgrimage site that people can still go to, and it's considered a very nice national treasure for them. This is a depiction of the Sibyl of Cumae as she appeared, and we'll get into the book that she's holding later on, why that's important, because her books were key. And this cave complex with over 100 entrances that she lived in, you can still go into it today. So this is the actual entrance to the cave complex. They've built this sort of religious area over the front of it. You can see it's got a church-like look. It looks like steeples on a church with a nice roof. You go inside, and as I said, these volcanic caves have in many cases been built out with bricks, and they've kind of blocked out the area so that now you can go in there and see some cool stuff. So you go through this thing, and of course they now have electric lights in there. Think about for a minute how weird and dark and scary it would have been to go into these caves without all this lighting, because there wasn't any exterior light getting in. So it was very dark. Probably the only way that you would even be able to see where you were going was to carry a torch. So there would be this initiation type of experience of going in to see the Sibyl of Cumae, where you're carrying your torch, you're walking around in the dark, you're hearing dripping water and all these strange echoey reverberations of your voice and of your feet walking. And then eventually, if you're lucky, you'll find her and be able to experience her doing this bizarre practice. Maybe you'll see lights from her torches off in the distance. Now, as we go through the cave complex, they're not all squared off into that triangular shape. As you can see here, some of the caves are actually rounded off as well, and you can actually still see some of the fire marks on the wall from where people were carrying torches and the fire was burning the wall. So here's another example of a finished off volcanic cave in these Sibyl caves, where you can see where the bricks have been laid and everything else. And this is an example of a grotto. So I don't know if this is the grotto where she actually did it or not. That's not clear. But you can see that in this case, there was some light cracked through from the surface getting in, so it wasn't completely dark in there. And you'd have your water at the bottom with all the hot ethylene gas coming up, and you breathe that stuff, and then off you go. So the interesting thing about the Sibyl of Cumae is that a lot of people didn't want to go into those caves. They were really scary. They didn't know what the heck was going to happen. And so she created a very interesting way of working where she would get into this consciousness, she would experience the ethylene, the bay laurel extract, she would write down her prophecies on leaves from an oak tree. So we can assume that she had an excellent source of oak, that there was some kind of oak tree that was dropping its leaves into the cave so that she had plenty of these to use. And she apparently had small enough handwriting that on fairly large oak leaves, she was able to write a decent... She would write these prophecies down onto oak leaves and then leave them at the mouth of any one of over 100 entrances to the cave complex. And it wasn't like she used the same mouth. She would go around and she would use different cave entrances at different times. The interesting part of the story is that when people found these leaves and they read what the writing said, those writings contained accurate, incredible prophecies of things that affected everyone. Things that were obvious, things that were public, things that could not be denied. And as a result, she developed an incredibly intense reputation. It was very common for people to be hanging around those caves waiting for her to drop those leaves off. But remember, in case someone did not find the leaves, they would simply blow away. That's one of the bizarre aspects of this, is that she didn't care if anybody was waiting for these leaves or not, and undoubtedly many of them just vanished over time. So as a result of how incredibly accurate her prophecies were on these leaves, the word gets all the way back up the chain of command to who was the king of Rome at the time, and that is King Tarquin. The time frame that we're dealing with, according to historical record, is roughly 540 BC, thereabouts, 530, something like that. So we're dealing with an era that is still well before the arrival of Jesus of Nazareth, and yet we're dealing with a very amazing phenomenon, a phenomenon that starts to catch fire in the public consciousness. And the priests apparently were able to converse with her and found out had created a series of 9 books out of oak leaves. And in fact, believe it or not, the actual term for pages in a book, one of the archaic terms for pages in a book is leaves. Leaves of a book, meaning pages of a book. And that comes from her work. That comes from how renowned she became as a psychic. So the priests went in there, and she tells them to get her in touch with the king of Rome, because she has created 9 books worth of these oak leaves, and she's written it all out on the leaves and made pages out of them. And that these 9 books, get this, contain the entire future history of Rome. Future history of Rome. Yes, she claimed that everything that was going to happen to Rome was all laid out in these books, that it was chronological. She was going to tell you the year. She was going to tell you the event. Anything negative that would happen, anything that could hurt Rome, was all contained in these books. Well, that's a pretty outrageous claim to make, obviously. But look at the background. Look at how accurate she was. Look at what was happening when people found these leaves. The leaves were actually very popular because the prophecies were so consistently accurate. So bear in mind that when the priests go to the king of Rome, they are very excited about this. They say that she wants to sell these books to them, and the priests are saying, look, we've never seen anything like this. Yes, we have 11 other oracles out there. Yes, they're good. Yes, people revere these women, but there is nothing like this. This lady is in a whole other echelon that we've never seen before. So if she says these books have the future history of Rome, this lady is in a whole other echelon that we've never seen before. So if she says these books have the future history of Rome and it's chronological and it's going to tell us what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, we need those books. So the king finally said, okay, fine, bring her in. We'll hear what she has to say. So the priests went into that dark grotto. They found her. She carries the books with her. They bring the books to the king, and she gets an audience with the king. Now she's in this nice royal room with all the drapery and the colors and the pomp and circumstance. Everybody's got outrageous costumes on, and there's gold everywhere. It's a very opulent location where this is taking place. In this location, where there's obviously gold all over the place, the king approaches her. He's up on the throne. She's down there on the ground. She's got the 9 books. And he says, okay, I've heard a lot of stories about you, and it sounds like you're really amazing. My priests at least say so. I'm not sure if it's true. But they say that you have these 9 books and that you want to sell them to me. How much do you want for them? And she says, 9 bags of gold. Now, at this point, the king is very, very upset with her, because 9 bags of gold is a tremendous amount of money. A bag of gold is literally a sack like this big, and if you've ever been lucky enough to hold on to some gold, which I have, it's very heavy. A bag of gold is going to be extremely heavy. So just to be able to carry 9 bags of gold would require a team of donkeys. So that's a lot of money. That's an incredible amount of money. Think about how much an ounce of gold is worth today. And a bag of gold, we're talking about many, many, many pounds. So he's not at all willing to give her 9. So she sets a fire right in front of him. She goes, fine. And she burns 3 of the 9 books. And the priests are horrified because they know these books are the real deal. And they're watching them burn right in front of the king. There's nothing they can do about it. She turns around, she walks away, storms off in disgust. The priests work on the king. She continues to do these leaves. The prophecies are getting even more accurate. The priests say to the king, come on, you've got to give her another chance. Bring her in. She's still got 6 books. Let's try this again. So they run through the whole process a second time. She's brought in front of the king, 6 books. And he says, how much do you want for it? And she still says 9 bags of gold. The king is, you know, the priests are really begging him at this point, please don't do this, please don't do this. But he's angry, he's rude, and she gets angry and she burns 3 more of the books right in front of him and storms off again. Now we get to the third and final instance of this, where now she comes back and she's only got 3 books left. Now bear in mind that she might have been a master negotiator. She may have been psychic enough to see that he was going to turn her down the first 2 times. You could hopefully think that the first 6 books were blank and that she just did that as a setup. If she really could see the future, maybe that's what happened. Anyway, the point is she's now got only 3 books left, but she's done so much more work with these leaves that the prophecies are widely known. And she says to the king, 9 bags of gold. The priests are literally on their knees begging him, please, I will give you everything I've got. You never have to pay me again. Just buy the books. For God's sake, you've got to know what's in there. It's vital to our national security. So finally, just buy the books. For God's sake, you've got to know what's in there. It's vital to our national security. So finally, the king relents and actually pays her the 9 bags of gold. And they had a whole team of donkeys with the sticks across from one donkey to the next, carrying these bags of gold, hauling them back into these volcanic caves, which is a long distance. So all of this extra work had to be done so she could go off with her 9 bags of gold, which she did. And then comes the good stuff. The priests are all excited, and they've got to know what's in there. So they run off with the books, and they start reading them, and they start looking, and they realize, my God, there's chronological dating in here. It's telling us what's going to happen. It's telling us where it's going to happen. It's telling us, I mean, it's strange, and it's wording that we don't really quite understand. It's kind of symbolic. It doesn't always really make sense, but you definitely get the gist of it. You definitely get the sense that there's something here that's very important. And we need to look at this, and it also is going to tell us when things are going to happen. So sure enough, they call the king over and they say, King, it says here that, we're going to have a famine in the spring, that people are going to be starving. What the heck do we do? So after a few rounds of this, the king believed that these prophecies were real. So he said, okay, let's take all of the grain that we're going to use that we would normally be storing in open air, and we're going to put this grain under armed guard. We're going to keep it in a secure vault so no one can steal it, because it clearly says that we all are starving in the spring. We can prevent that. These prophecies must have been given to us so that we can remember in the spring the sun comes out and you're planting, but there's really no crops. So that's when you really need to have food in this traditional kind of society. The guards were there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Nobody gets in. Nobody's able to see what's going on. They get to the spring, they open up the vault, and oh my God, the vault had flooded. Nobody knew that water was getting in because nobody was allowed inside. Nobody was tasked with checking the health of the grain. The water had caused the grain to rot and mold, and it was all useless. And then everybody goes into a famine, which is what the prophecy said. But wait a minute, if we hadn't put this grain into this room in the first place, if we'd kept it where we normally would have kept it, it would have been fine. Nothing would have happened. The fact that we read the prophecy, the fact that we tried to prevent the prophecy, actually caused the prophecy to come true. And it wouldn't have come true otherwise. This is the origin of the myth of the so-called leprechaun wish. A leprechaun in traditional mythology, of course, is this little green guy, some kind of small humanoid, who comes out from the woods, and he gives you the ability to grant your wishes, and you get 3 wishes, but whatever you ask for ends up becoming like a curse. So there's this interesting idea here that if you're coming from a place of ego and you get extraterrestrial assistance on granting your wishes, or in this case, future prophecy, they're not necessarily trying to do you a favor. In fact, the interesting thing is that they realized these prophecies were accurate, but they also realized favor. In fact, the interesting thing is that they realized these prophecies were accurate, but they also realized that if they read them, it became self-fulfilling. The things they would try to do to throw off the prophecy would actually cause the prophecy to occur. Now, as I've said in conferences before, in the movie The Matrix, who does Neo end up meeting with? The Oracle. And what does she say to him as he's about to leave the room? She goes, "And don't worry about the vase." And then he goes, "What vase?" And because he says what vase, he turns around and he hits the vase with his elbow. And then it smashes. And then you remember the scene, she goes, "What's really going to bake your noodle is, would you have broken it if I hadn't have said anything?" And that's it. That is a modern depiction of the legend of the Sibyl. Now bear in mind that this government now has a problem. They have documents that show their vulnerability to a T. If anybody else got their hands on these documents, then they would know exactly when to invade. You want to invade when there's a famine. You want to invade when there's a big fire. You want to invade when the river is overflowing. You want to invade when there is severe weather or when there is a public uprising or some sort of revolution. That's when you want to do it. And that book would give it away. So this becomes a matter of vital national security. They cannot allow this book to get into the hands of the enemy, and they also cannot look at it, because if one person reads a particular chronologically dated prophecy and knows the information, that could make these bad things happen. So they needed to hide it away. And this is where they actually built the ancient Roman equivalent of Area 51. The tallest hill in Rome was Capitoline Hill, and up at the top of that hill, they built something called the Temple of Jupiter. And it was an honor to the Greek gods, which again were very likely extraterrestrials. And the Temple of Jupiter had multiple stations of armed guards, and if you could get inside and down in the middle, then there was a vault in there after multiple levels of armed guards where the Sibylline books were contained. And the prophecies were deemed to be so dangerous that they would not go in there to read them until they were already in a national emergency. It was already too late. Only then were the high priests authorized to go through those layers of the guards, to go into the vault, to read the books. Well, this is where the story gets interesting. Rome's own decline, Rome's own collapse was written into the books. And they realized it was too late. By the time they went in there and they saw what it actually said, it was over. Rome had collapsed. And in the aftermath of this, when Rome was in decline, it wasn't such a big deal anymore whether these books were kept secret, because Rome was in ruins. So at that point, they allowed some of the information to be copied out of the books and actually written down and publicly distributed. And what's most interesting is that that information had a prophetic timeline that goes straight through to our own future, a future that we haven't seen yet. And if it was that accurate before, now it's got to go even farther. Here's where it gets really states, and on the bottom of the seal it says Novus Ordo Seclorum. We could talk at great length about what that may mean. Some people think it's New World Order or New Secular Order. We could talk about the fact that the M in Seclorum, and then the A in Annuit, the S in Septus, the N in Novus, the O in Ordo, M-A-S-O-N. You can actually draw lines between those and write the word Mason, and that's very likely not an accident. But anyway, where is this Novus Ordo Seclorum thing coming from? The answer comes from the Civil War hero Charles A.L. Totten, as I said in a previous episode, but it's worth reviewing all this again. Here he was as a young man in the Civil War, And here he was as an older man looking, as I've said, disturbingly similar to Sigmund Freud. And in 1882, he wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Treasury, Charles Folger. And it was on February 10th. Now, think about it. If you are so significant that you write a letter to the Secretary of the Treasury and it becomes part of the congressional record, you're not just an ordinary person. This is a war hero. He was a lieutenant, and he definitely had some pull, and it's almost certainly the case that he was a high-ranking Freemason and a member of these secret orders that knew what was really going on. And he's telling the Secretary of the Treasury what the heck that Great Seal really means. They had to put it on public record. So how does he know this? Where did he get this information from? But this is what he said. Novus Ordo Seclorum is a quotation from the 4th Eclogue and was borrowed in turn by Virgil from the mystic Sibylline records. Well, now we know what those are. The Sibylline records are the books from Sibyl. And sure enough, those 3 books were copied over, at least some of them, were copied over into Virgil's Eclogues. And sure enough, those 3 books were copied over, at least some of them, were copied over into Virgil's Eclogues. An eclogue is simply a type of poetry. So he wrote them down. And ultimately, during that time that Rome was at its peak, those books were considered so valuable that it was worth this entire room filled with gold to them. There was nothing of greater value. There was no greater treasure. That was their number one thing. So Virgil got to write that stuff and transcribe it, and now we have a war hero telling the Secretary of the Treasury that Novus Ordo Seclorum is a shortened form of another quotation from Virgil from the Sibylline mystery text. This is amazing. But what's even more amazing is what happens once we see what it actually means. The original Latin is Magnus ab integro seclorum nascitur ordo, and it translates as a mighty order of ages is born anew. Well, this is exactly what we've been talking about, that extraterrestrials keep planting into different ancient teachings. This idea that there is a cyclical order of ages, a mighty cycle, a cycle that takes 25,000 years, that at the end of the cycle, there's this massive rebirth, and there's a spontaneous human evolution. So that quote, Novus Ordo Seclorum, is a shortened version of this sentence right here. A mighty order of ages is born anew. But you also have to read what it says after that. It says both the prophetic Virgin and Saturnian kingdoms now return. Well, Saturn is a planet, and Virgo is a constellation of stars. So it seems that this is talking about people who might have lived in or around Saturn, and now, of course, on Cosmic Disclosure, we've heard that there are multiple ET groups living in the moons of Saturn. That could be in kingdoms now return. Then it says, a new progeny is let down from the lofty heavens. Well, progeny means offspring, a new form of life. So it's talking about some kind of extraterrestrial coming here, but it's also talking about somebody being born, some new type of human. And it gets a lot more specific in these prophecies. Check this out. The boy soon to be born, in whom the Iron Age shall come to an end, and the Golden One shall arise again in the whole earth. This is really, really fascinating, because the Golden One seems to be a reference to the ascended light body. And notice it says the whole earth. It's not just one person, it's not just a Messiah, it's a worldwide phenomenon of light body activation. This is why I think that benevolent extraterrestrials worked through the Sibyl to make sure that this prophecy got written down. And they did a lot of sizzle for the Roman government, but it didn't help them. They weren't able to use those books in any way that actually paid off for them. They didn't get any more power. In fact, it damaged them to read those books. But then when they were declined, this prophecy gets stored and put into the dollar bill of all places. So now we know what it really says, and it's talking about an ascension prophecy of light body activation. And the prophecy is benevolent. It's not this New World Order thing. Let's read on what happens next. It says, whatso tracks remain of our old wickedness, once done away, shall free the earth from never ceasing fear. Well, that's a really great thing, because that means that we're not dealing with pain, we're not dealing with evil. All of that stuff is gone. That's what this prophecy is saying. It's a harmonious world that's been transformed into something much higher and much better. Then it says, he shall receive the life of gods and see heroes. The prophecy is saying it's a harmonious world that's been transformed into something much higher and much better. Then it says, he shall receive the life of gods and see heroes with gods commingling, and himself be seen of them, meaning that we become like the gods. And heroes, of course, are the offspring of gods and humans, so it's like a human ET hybrid. But we become like them. We gain their abilities. Telepathy, telekinesis, all this stuff is in the prophecy. And then they reign over a world at peace. So this is a very, very interesting symbol that was put into the dollar bill, because if you think about what that all-seeing eye in the triangle could represent, and all of the things we've talked about in other episodes about the solar flash, the all-seeing eye could actually represent the solar flash itself. Because we've talked about the fact that the Great Pyramid has 6 sides with a flat top, and 6 in pyramid numerology means incompletion, imperfection, and evil. Whereas 5, when the capstone comes back, the number 5 means perfection, divinity, and ascension. So the restoration of the capstone is what transforms us into this ascended society, and we see a flash of light associated with that. So again, I believe this symbol, the symbol on the dollar, was originally positive, something that came from benevolent extraterrestrials, and it was then manipulated and contorted into something that is now being used for the negative. It has been widely reported that you have 13 courses on the pyramid, just like the 13 Baktuns in the Mayan calendar. There's 72 bricks in the pyramid, which happens to correspond to the 72 years that it takes our solar system to drift by 1 degree. And they created these principles of freedom. They created these principles of equality, hoping that it would help to foster this ascension that they were expecting. But they've been expecting it behind the scenes, never openly. So now we have more negative groups since the time of the Founding Fathers that have come in, and they've taken a negative spin on this, where they think they will be ascending, they will become the gods, and everyone else will need to be wiped out. But the original prophecy is very, very positive. Well, that's all the time we have in this episode of Wisdom Teachings. This little piece of Roman history is very valuable in setting up the Old Testament and the New Testament, as we're going to see. I'm David Wilcock, and this is Wisdom Teachings, bringing you the information you need that will set you free. Thanks for watching.